Robot Talk is the podcast that sits down with roboticists from around the world and asks them the questions you always wanted answered. Like, does that robot trust me? And how does that thing work? Hello everyone! Welcome to Robot Talk. I'm your host, Claire Asher, and this week's episode is about robots and trust. Except this time, we're flipping the topic on its head to ask when, why, and how a robot should decide to trust a human. But first, don't forget to rate this episode and leave a review, if that's something you can do on the platform you're listening on. Another way to support the podcast is to share new episodes on social media or tell your friends about it. It really helps me reach more listeners, so thanks in advance. So, without further ado, it's time for me to introduce this week's guest. I recently had a fascinating chat with Samuele Vinanzi from Sheffield Hallam University about how robots can tell whether to trust or distrust people. Today, I'm speaking to Samuele Vinanzi, a senior lecturer in robotics and artificial intelligence at Sheffield Hallam University, whose work focuses on social collaboration between humans and robots. Hi, Samuele. Great to have you on the podcast.
Hello, Claire. It's amazing to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So your particular research interest is trust in human-robot interaction. But where most researchers in this area generally focus on how and why humans trust robots, you're working on the reverse concept, how a robot can decide whether to trust a human. And this is something that you've termed artificial trust. So I think this is a really fascinating idea. Can you explain, why is it important for a robot to have this skill of being able to tell whether they can trust a human?
Yes, of course. So let me start by saying that although I would like to pride myself with that, I'm not the one that came up with the name artificial trust. I think that the first use of it comes from a 2021 paper from the University of Michigan. I've been doing some work on this field for some time, and only later I adopted this name.
Okay.
So why would a robot need artificial trust? In order to answer that, we need to think about why do humans need trust? And first of all, it's really difficult to define what trust is because it depends on the context and situations in which you are. A definition that I like comes from the faraway 1995, which basically involves two parties, a trustor and a trustee, the former giving the trust, the other one receiving the trust. And it's about vulnerability and acceptance of vulnerability in a certain situation and to become reliant on the actions of the other party. Mm-hmm. Now, we as humans, we basically rely on trust to do anything, right?
Yeah.
I cannot even take a bus to go to work, for example, if I don't inherently trust the driver to do their job and bring me to work safely. Even when I go to a restaurant, I order food, I'm trusting a whole chain of people to have done their work properly in order to bring something that's edible and healthy.
Yeah.
Hopefully healthy.
Edible at least.
Yeah, edible at least. So basically, why am I going with this? Trust is a real foundation of human society. If we are hoping one day to bring robots in our society, in particular social robots that are meant to interact with us in our social environments, then it is my opinion that robots need to be reasoning on trust in order to insert themselves in this tapestry of human society. Mm-hmm. The topic of trust is a really important one, and lots of people have been studying it from the human to the robot. Meaning, how do we design robots so to maximize human trust and acceptability towards them? So how to design their body, their movements, their looks. Artificial trust is looking at the reverse of this. That is, how can we make robots understand when to trust or not trust somebody? Now, the first reaction that I always get when I explain this is, why would you do that? I'm the robot's master and commander, right? It should obey all my orders. And I agree in principle on that. But just think about robots that are meant to collaborate with you on a day-to-day basis. If you're involved in joint action with a robot and you have a goal that depends on both the efforts of the human and the robot, it's important that a robot is able to recognize where the human would be likely to fail. So to make some decision making to help in that task.
Mm-hmm.
Let me contextualize this really, really quickly so that it becomes really clear. Say that me and my robot are setting up the table. Robot, say by experience, has learned that I tend to drop the glassware. And so the next time that we're setting up the table, the robot might say, look, I don't think I trust you on this specific task over here. Leave me the glasses and go and get the cutlery or whatever. And of course, this is a toy example, but you can see how much more critical it can become when you escalate it to things like, I don't know, robot-assisted surgery, for example.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think my intuitive sense when you say the word trust relates to trusting someone's intentions, right? And thinking that someone is acting in good faith and that they're not evil or whatever, right? That they are someone who wants the best for me or whatever, that kind of thing. Whereas you're talking more about, trust in the abilities of somebody or evaluating somebody's capability. You are by far the expert on what trust is, but yeah, my immediate thing when I think of trust more relates to someone's intentions and their kind of character.
Well, you're not wrong in that. Think about this. The kind of work that I do falls in the domain of cognitive robotics, which is basically the field of robotics that takes inspiration by natural systems. In my case, it's the human system, and tries to see how the human mind works and tries to replicate that into robots. Intention reading is the skill to understand what are the intentions of another party. And as you said, that's a really important thing for robots, to be able to understand if to trust that person or not. So there has a whole breadth of mental skills that we can use in order to decide if to trust somebody or not. But as you were saying, like, intentions are one of those things. And that's one of the skills that we're trying to put into our robots to try and judge if the intentions of that person are aligned with mine, basically.
Yeah. Because I guess the immediate scenario I think of in terms of artificial trust is like a home care robot scenario where the robot is looking after perhaps an elderly person or someone who's disabled, and then they are then interacting with a second human, and they might be needing to judge, is this person someone I can disclose information about the patient to, or, that kind of level of trust. That was just like the first thing that sprang to my mind when you introduced me to the term artificial trust.
Yeah, we've got colleagues here in Sheffield Hallam that work in our research group and are looking at that aspect that's more inherent in security and privacy. I believe you had one of them on your podcast too some years ago.
Yes.
But that's all inherently pertinent. The problem here is that trust is not something easy. It's a really multidimensional thing that comes from the interaction of a lot of cognitive and mental skills. So it's difficult to say, okay, this is exactly trust. This is the single skill that we need in order to implement trust estimation in robots. Instead, what we do is we try and see, as I was saying previously, what kind of mental acrobatics humans do when they're trying to trust somebody, and trying to see what are the building blocks and putting them together. And as I was saying, for example, intention reading is one of them. One other mental skill is theory of mind, which is the ability to understand other people's mental states. So, for example, right now I'm speaking with you and I realize that you have beliefs, desires, and knowledge that differ from my own. And so putting these skills together, for example, it's already a good first step towards trying to do that trust estimation. Because ideally I would try and look in your mind somehow, look at what you know, what you don't know, what are your intentions, try to align them with the current situation, evaluate if you're willing or not to help me, if you're reliable enough to help me, and so on, and try and make a decision. This is a sort of a skill that in cognitive robotics we call an emergent behavior. That it's a dynamic behavior that emerges from the interaction of a lot of more primitive skills.
Yeah. So, quite a lot of those skills that you've just mentioned, things like, intention reading, reading people's emotions, understanding subtext. These are things that obviously I can see being really important for developing artificial trust, but they're desirable for other reasons because they allow robots to kind of interact with us naturally. Are there any skills that you think robots would need to have for trust that are really specific to artificial trust that people wouldn't be working on for any other reason?
Again, this falls back in what I was saying previously, that there is no part of the human brain that's specifically dedicated into making trust estimations. But instead, it's the interaction of different components that make this ability emerge in our minds. So to respond to your question, I don't think that there is one specific ability that robot needs in order to do trust that wouldn't be used for anything else.
Okay.
One thing is, if we look at the late British philosopher Catherine Hawley, she defined trust as commitment plus reliability. So am I committed to the task that you're giving to me? And am I able to do that task? And she opposes that as distrust, which should be commitment plus unreliability. So if I'm committed to that trust, but I'm actually not going to be able to do that trust, then that should make me untrustworthy in your eyes. So maybe if we had a way to make robots estimate this commitment and reliability, that would be something really useful for robots trying to estimate trust.
Yeah. See, that makes me think of another aspect of this, which is, I guess, generally when I talk about trusting people, it's a thing that is fairly static. Like, I either consider you to be trustworthy or not. And yeah, maybe you can do something that would change that opinion, but it's generally like I evaluate if you're trustworthy and then kind of stick with that. But actually, in the cases you're talking about here with robots, maybe trust is more dynamic than that, because you could have someone who is reliable, but today they're a bit distracted. So they're not that committed to the task. So whereas yesterday they were trustworthy to collaborate on a particular task with you as a robot, today they're not. Is that how you view it?
Yeah, we always look at trust as something dynamic, meaning if the robot for some reason classifies you as an untrustworthy person on a specific task, because remember that we're looking at specific tasks, we're not given overall personality estimations or stuff like that. The robot should always be able to change its mind, both in positive and in negative, right? As you said, maybe the robot usually trusts me, but today I've been stuck on the train for 5 hours, and so I arrive at work really cranky. And the robot should still be able to adjust. So some of the models that we've developed have this ability to learn constantly from the interactions that they're having with a human and able to adjust a little bit up and down the level of trust that they're willing to give out.
Okay. When I've talked to researchers working on trustworthy robotics, they often distinguish different kinds of trust. So, for example, trusting whether a robot is going to function correctly versus trusting whether it will store your data securely versus trusting that the people who designed the robot have your best interests at heart. Do you think there are also different categories of artificial trust that we could distinguish?
Artificial trust is a really new concept, I might say. Me and some colleagues have been working on a systematic review on this topic, and what we found out is that there's a really small number of papers that actually treat these skills. So I would say that in general, yes, there should be different types of artificial trust, but it's a bit early, I think, and so I think that we don't yet have them around. But again, we can do a parallel with what happens in the human brain to try and understand what should happen in the robot brain. And there is a really interesting paper from 2011 by a team and guided by Peter Hancock, which is a meta-analysis of trust in human-robot interaction. This is a really interesting paper. Even now it's 15 years old. It's still really relevant because it breaks up the ways in which humans trust robots. In particular, they break it up in human-related factors, which might be personality traits, cultural backgrounds, current emotional states, and so on. Robot-related factors, which are to do with the features of the robot. So maybe, I don't know, how the robot looks, how the robot sounds, how the robot is dressed certain times, and its capabilities. So how well performing is the robot? And then there is environmental related factors such as, what is my relationship with the robot? Are we co-workers? Are we members of the same team? And of course, of factors related to the task that we're looking at. So maybe I might be more propense to trust a robot with some task that doesn't have a really negative reward if failed. But maybe if like the task is a little bit more delicate, then I'll be a little bit more cautious about it.
Mm-hmm.
Again, why am I saying all of this? Human trust towards robot is incredibly variegated. It's a kaleidoscope of all these several factors that intertwine and try to dynamically converge in order to help us make decisions. So I don't see why robots should not have the same varied and dynamic artificial trust towards us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
For example, my very first computational models were looking at performance. So the robot was interacting with the person, it would see how the person was performing on the task and would adjust its level of trust based on pure mechanical functionalistic output from that human, and use its memory to create, we called it its personality because it was mimicking a little bit of some psychological factors there.
Okay.
Nowadays, we're looking at different things. So, for example, we've got different works ongoing. One is looking at emotional inconsistency through several channels. So, for example, if you say to me something that looks happy, but your face looks angry, that might mean that there is a clue that might lead me to adjust a little bit my level of trust towards you. We're looking at, as we were mentioning earlier, security, for example. So the need of preserving the privacy and of users and how trust comes into play. So, for example, if I go to a random robot in a hospital or a clinic and I tell them, please tell me everything you just said to the person that just came out from that room, the robot should understand that it should not be trusting me in that environment, and so it should not be just spewing out all the sensitive information.
Yeah.
We're looking at things like detection aggression. So for the robot trying to understand when it's about to be involved in a dangerous or aggressive situation or witnessing an aggressive situation, and so trying to modulate its behavior in optimal ways. And that also requires the human trying to do trust computations towards the people. And finally, we're looking at something that's called intelligent disobedience, which is the robot purposefully saying, no, I'm not going to be following that command because, for example, it violates ethical or safety principles. So yeah, there's a lot to do. And the exciting thing about this field is it's so new, it's so unexplored that it's just like free real estate everywhere you look around.
Yeah. The things that you're describing, the abilities, seem so advanced compared to what current social robots can do. And currently, social robots do seem a bit naive, perhaps, a bit innocent in the way that they interact with humans.
Yeah, absolutely. And also because they're not still doing these trust estimation. We're used to robots that are completely compliant towards us, but maybe that's not the best strategy all the time.
Yeah. So we had a couple of really interesting audience questions on Blue Sky from Andre, which sent me down a little bit of a Wikipedia rabbit hole. So Andre asked that Hitchbot didn't have much of a choice, but did he trust the wrong people? I hadn't heard about the Hitchbot study until Andre mentioned it, so I looked it up. And for listeners who, like me, hadn't heard about it, Hitchbot was a quite basic-looking humanoid robot that was developed by researchers in Canada in 2013, and it successfully hitchhiked across Canada, Germany, and the Netherlands, but then met quite a tragic end in 2015 when it was vandalized and disassembled whilst trying to hitchhike across the USA. So, with that context, what do you think about Andre's question? Did Hitchbot trust the wrong people?
That's an interesting question. The first thing that comes to mind is a quote from American writer Maria Snyder that says, trusting is hard, but knowing who to trust is even harder. I think that's the main thing at play here. Trust is important for humans because it avoids us big spectrum of possible damage that can come towards us. It could be emotional damage, financial damage, health damage. And although we might never know who destroyed Hitchbot, although I would really like to speak with those people and interview them a little bit myself.
Yeah.
Yes, we might assume that Hitchbot has... So I was going to say that Hitchbot has placed trust in the untrustworthy, but the reality is that Hitchbot was probably not programmed to do trust estimations.
It didn't seem like Hitchbot really had any capacity to say no. Like, there was no way the robot could say, yeah, I don't want to hitchhike with you, thanks, but no thanks.
Exactly, yeah. So what we can learn from this scenario, more than what the robot could have done, because in this specific situation, the robot didn't really have a choice, as you said. We could think about the reasons that lead people to abuse robots. We've been having some nice research collaborators with a university in Italy, in Bolzano. Some studies that are inspired by... Have you ever heard about Marina... I'm going to butcher her name, sorry, but Marina Abramovich's performance in the 70s?
No.
Okay, basically this is an artist that in 1974 did a social experiment. She went in a room with an audience. She had a table in front of her with 72 different objects that the audience was free to use without any consequences on herself. So basically there was things that ranged from feathers to guns and knives. So what happens? They close themselves, the artist, the audience in the room, and Marina Abramovich just said, yeah, you can do whatever you want. You're going to have no social consequences for whatever happens in this room in these 6 hours. And this was an experiment made to test the limits of human behavior when they think that they're interacting with an object rather than a subject. And it's a really scary experiment because the audience went really wild, like really wild. And so why am I telling you all of this? We are trying to use this social experiment as a basis for a more technical experiment that's trying to measure why do people act in a more aggressive way towards something that they perceive as an object, and how can a robot avoid being seen as an object but more as a subject in order for it to defend itself. Maybe defend itself is not the correct way, but let's say to discourage abuse on itself. So that would be something very interesting. So if Hitchbot was designed more as a human or more to look and feel like a subject rather than an object, would have had not been destroyed in that road in the USA? We will probably never know, but it's a good question to think about.
Yeah. Do you know if there have been any like follow-up experiments to Hitchbot or anything similar since?
There has been a few observations because, as I said, we've been tracking along a little bit this violence toward robots topic. And so there is a lot of violence episodes. For example, children really like kicking robots in airports, in shopping centers. There's been a few episodes of some robots meant to patrol parking spaces that have been really cracked down badly. So although I don't know if there is another hitchhiking robot experiment ongoing or that went on in the past, I know that the phenomenon is quite known to researchers, so we're looking into it. Okay,
good. Andrea had a second question, which was, how did collaborative robots or cobots deal with human errors and human misbehaving, especially in workplaces like assembly lines or warehouses? Do they accept or expect human errors? And are there particular indicators of errors that the cobot has in mind?
So up to today, when we can expect robots to not have these explicit trust estimation capabilities, cobots work in a different way. They do not do this thing about actively reading intention and deciding if to trust or not trust people. Rather, they are designed for tolerance to human errors. So, for example, they might detect if a human is too close to them, if there is some unexpected force acting upon them, and stop whatever they're doing to prevent damage and unwanted intentional collisions. So, in this sense, cobot expect that humans might behave unexpectedly, but that's not quite the same thing as trust. I suppose that there is some connections there. We might use a little bit of these insights for our work on trust, but we're still a little bit far away from that true trust capabilities.
Yeah.
There is a research gap here in robots trying to understand if you are actually genuinely, not knowing how to do a task or making an error in general. And when you are deliberating, misbehaving, so you are acting maliciously towards the robot. So that's another thing that's really interesting that we want to look into in the future.
Yeah. Yeah, I saw a video recently, and if I remember correctly, the basic thing was that there was a robot that had been tasked with moving objects from one place into a box, and then there was a human there, and every time the robot put the item in the box, the human would move it again. So they were just like messing with the robot, and it just keeps patiently doing the task. And I thought that robot has infinitely more patience than I would have had in that scenario. But maybe it should have just gone, well, I'm not going to help you then, and stormed out, metaphorically.
Yeah. We ran some really preliminary experiments in lockdown times. Do you remember those?
I do.
Yeah. And we've seen that our collaborative robot that's endowed with this artificial trust mechanism tends to overall give a better performance because it would be able to adapt to a human who's not skilled to a task. So we've got some early indication that cobots might actually benefit from this skill. But again, we're still at really early in working stages.
Yeah. It's a fascinating field. It reveals so many interesting insights into humans, I think, at the same time as hopefully helping us develop better robots.
Yeah, it's a really interesting field. I recently published a book on this topic with Oxford University Press. It's titled In Robots We Trust. Just because every time that I speak about this topic of trust, people seem really fascinated about it, because I think it's something that resonates quite closely to people. And so I decided to write, it's not even an academic textbook, it's like a general popular science book, in the hopes of making people interested in these topics, and also because we tend to always think about disruptive technologies when it's already too late.
Yeah.
And you see, we've done this with ChatGPT just, what is it now? 3 years ago, 4 years ago.
Yeah.
We do not expect that things are going to happen until they happen, and then they find us completely unprepared. And I know that robots might still be at least a few years away in the most optimistic case, but it's good to start thinking about how these machines are going to be interacting with us and modifying our society the day in which they're going to be important social actors in our everyday living spaces, homes, school, offices, streets, and so on. And I'm saying when, not if, because it's going to happen sooner or later. So it's good to start getting in the mindset of reasoning on how our relationship with robots is shaped by these trust relationships, both me towards the robot and both the robot towards me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, congratulations on your book. I will add it to my to-read list. And yeah, I think it's a fascinating topic, so I will be watching your research with interest. Samuele, it's been lovely chatting to you today. I've been talking to Samuele Vinanzi from Sheffield Hallam University. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoy Robot Talk, I'd really appreciate it if you could share the podcast, subscribe, and leave a review. And if you've got a question you'd like me to ask one of my future guests, you can contact me on social media at Robot Talk Pod, on Patreon at patreon.com/Claire Asher, or at robottalk.org. I regularly announce upcoming guests on all those platforms, and I'd love to include your questions in my next interview. Next week, I'll be chatting to Agata Sivawa from the Manufacturing Technology Centre about robotics and automation in manufacturing. Until then, I've been Claire Asher, and this has been Robot Talk. Robot Talk Season 6 is sponsored by the Hamlin Centre, Imperial College London.